Without any further ado, I will welcome you all here again tonight to this webinar, how to maximize your maths grade. For ye guys here, you're all looking, I think, to get between a H6 and a H3. Now, this was one of the questions on the survey that I asked students, and from the first 52 people who answered this question, has your expectations gone up, down, or stayed the same since doing your mock maths exam? And you will see that, you know, for an awful lot of people, the answer is that their expectations of how they'll do in the Leaving Cert has gone down. A good few people have stayed the same. There's very few people, I think it was only 2 from the 52, their expectations went up. And you can see here, there's a good cohort have not done their maths pre yet. Are any of you in that boat that you haven't done your maths exam yet? Because of course there are plenty of people in that situation, I won't be giving any, naturally we won't be going through any details about the actual exam. A comment has come in here, and I think it resonates with something you're going to see now in a moment. Emma says, I couldn't answer anything on maths paper 2. Now, before I continue, I better put my hands up here and say, I do write one of the pre-papers that's on this year's Leaving Cert. So some of you will have done my paper. But I have a funny feeling that Emma, the one that I wrote, is not the one you're talking about. So there are very hard maths pre's out there. I would say there's 3 official pre's out there, and one of them is particularly difficult. I think the 2 Examcraft pre's represent what's roughly speaking around the standard that the Leaving Cert will be. And I'll talk a little bit more about that now in a moment. Okay, I'm going to show you some questions now. Some of them I'll answer straight away, and some of them I'll answer as I go through the presentation. So, okay. These are some of the comments and questions that came through on the survey. I thought I was going okay at maths, but my pre-exam was a complete disaster. The only consolation was that everyone thought the same. I want to stay at higher, but is it too risky? Put up your hand or type in me into the chat if that's you, if that represents what you're thinking. Yes, there's an awful lot of me's coming in and a lot of hands raised there, as you can see. I'm reading one comment here that kind of really, I suppose, significant comment here. It says, usually I get H1s or H2s in maths class tests, but just practicing maths exam questions, and I'm certain to fail the pre. So, okay, so this student hasn't done the exam yet, but she is getting at a point that's mentioned here in some of the questions, the difference between, how you do when you're doing your homework, how you do in a small class test, and then what happens when you go to sit down and practice Leaving Cert questions and do the pre-exam, for example. And I will explain all that. Now, I suppose this person has a serious question. I want to stay at higher, but is it too risky? Now, what I'm going to say to you is this, as someone who does write one of the pre-exams. The pre-exams are challenging, okay? And some of them I would suggest can be unfairly challenging, like very, very difficult, okay? Now you might say, well, why are they so hard? Why is it? Well, I will say for the one I set anyway, our objective is to try and set it at the standard of the Leaving Cert. Not harder than it, definitely not harder, but not easier either. Okay, so you want everyone to kind of see what the standard is likely to be. However, this next sentence is very important. In maths, it is more difficult to be ready for the pre-exam than I'm going to say in any other subject. Okay, why is that? It's because the length of the course. So my other subjects is economics. I have a set of economics Leaving Cert students this year. We're finished the course in economics. We've revised supply demand equilibrium and some of the market structures. And of course, that set the lads up in great shape for the actual pre-exam because they had the full choice of the paper, plus we'd revised topics. Contrast that to maths, where the day before, we're still learning brand new material. before the pre, no time for revision, and not all the topics done. And I have a gang of fellas there who are working very hard and have very high hopes. So that's the story. That's why it's so difficult in the pre, because there's no time for revision. And the thing about maths, you get better at maths by doing maths. You get better at maths by practicing maths and revising maths. But there's no time to revise before the pre's. That's why it's so hard. Okay, I'm looking down here at some of these questions. I see, I'm going to read a couple of them out. I'm going to ask some of my regular week-to-week students. They might answer one of these questions for me. They know what I'm going to say. The best method for studying maths with so little time left. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. How to approach an exam question when you don't know what to do. So I'm looking for some of my regular students to answer that one. I feel confident when I complete book questions on topics. Then I try exam questions and suddenly I begin to feel as I have no idea how to even apply the books to the questions. How can I help myself with this? So that's pretty much the exact same question that was asked by a student there a moment ago. Getting H1, H2s in small class tests. Practices exam paper questions completely lost. What tips can you give to start questions in maths? Once I get the start, I know what to do. I just can't get it. Okay. How much time should you spend on each question? Okay, so I'm going to answer those. And then after this, on the next slide, I'm going to be talking about topics. Okay, so I know some people are very interested in that. So the best method for studying maths with so little time, this is how you get better at maths, is you practice maths. That's it. Okay, no magic formula. It's practicing the questions helps you improve. You know, I have small kids here. I have 3 children, 9, 7, and 5, and they've all been, learning to cycle and things like that. There's no point them sitting down reading a book on how to cycle. Of course, when it comes to it, what do they have to do? They have to get on the bike, and their parents help them get ready, and of course, eventually they get the hang of it. And how do they get better? They get better by cycling more. And it's the same with this stuff. You practice maths, and it comes together. And the thing about it is, you get better and you improve at all the topics, even as you practice the other ones. So when you're practicing for the circle, your algebra is getting better. I'll go through more of that in time. This was the question I was going to, how would you approach an exam question when you don't know what to do? Well, one of my little catchphrases, my students are quoting it back to me here. They say, the question I say is like, if, the student said, if you don't know what to do what you know. So if you don't know what to do what you know. So thanks, guys. I see Geraldine and Mark there. I can see a number of others have Patrick and Aoife. Thanks very much. And Hannah. And I think I might have missed a few there. But thanks, guys. That you might be looking at a question as similar here with the one, how do you get started? You might be looking at a question, you're not sure what to do with it. It could be one of the problem-solving questions, a lot of text in there. What you got to do is you got to just try and get the first line written, see what it's about, see, what is it familiar to you? What does it look like? Sometimes once you get the first line down, the first line leads to the second line leads to the third line, and so on and so forth. And eventually the point comes where you see what it is and you might be able to do the question. Now, here's the thing though. This is another one of my catchphrases. If you guys are going for a H6, a H5, a H4, H3, as I always say, you don't have to get everything right. You just have to get everything started. Okay, there's a reason why I split this webinar into 2 sections and the weekly grinds into 2 groups. It's because if you're going from H6 to H3, I know that's a wide enough span, but particularly if you're going for H6, H5, what you're hoping is to get the easy questions right, kind of make a good stab at the middling questions and get the hard questions started. But if you're going for H1, H2, what you're looking to do is focus in on how to get the hard questions right. So it's a very different thing. Okay. I feel confident when I complete the book questions. As I said, that's a question very much like what was asked earlier. How that comes together is this, that once you get the course finished in school, you start practicing more and more exam paper questions. It is difficult to do exam paper questions as a teacher, to give them to students in 5th year and early in 6th year, because the topics overlap. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. Okay, how much time should you spend on each question? Like that's, I'm going to give a broad kind of answer to that, which is this, right? That in the paper before, when it was 300 marks, when you had to answer all the questions, there was 150 minutes. So basically, for every question, for every minute, you should be getting 2 marks, or for every mark, it should be half a minute. So if it was a 50-mark question, you should spend 25 minutes. Okay, now you only have to do, it's only 220 marks. So basically, there is more time. However, as the most broad kind of idea, if you keep the idea in your head that if it's a 50-mark question, you should be spending somewhere like 25 minutes on it, it is still a good rule of thumb, because you might well do extra questions in the exam. I'll talk about that again in a moment. Okay, so let me flick on to this next one. So there's a question here that says, I just got to make sure I stay on time here. How can I stay in touch so that I'll be alerted to when we're taking bookings for the Easter revision course and 21-day challenge, which is a revision course? If you've signed up for this here tonight, I think you will get those alerts. However, if you follow us on Instagram and Facebook, you'll definitely see them there. Okay, here's a question. With enough dedication, in your honest opinion, do you think a student can go from an average H5, H4 to H3, H2 in the real exam? Here's what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you a story from last year. Some of you who are down here in West Cork, who you know me in the real world, might know who this student is. Okay, but there was a girl came to my face-to-face classes last year. She started in the H6 to H3 class. She worked very, very hard for the year. During the year, around this time of the year, she asked to change, herself and her friend asked, could they change the H1, H2 class? I was happy out, no problem. And I noticed in there that they were going very well. And one day I called them, call them up at the end. I said, we were doing the circle, and they were like, I'm going to say some of the best in there that day. They were really going very well. And I said to them, come here, what's happening? How come, you've gone from being in the H6, H3 class, now all of a sudden you're flying in the H1, H2 class? And what this particular girl said was, she said, we've revised our expectations. We've revised our expectations. And that line stuck with me. I'm not sure exactly where she got that from, but that's what she said. And here was the story. Her teacher predicted for her a H3, absolutely, totally fine. Nothing that was, absolutely realistic, based on where she came from with her junior cert grade, where she'd been in 5th year, everything. That girl worked very, very hard. So did her friend. They worked very, very hard. She went in, the exam came up lovely for her, and she got a H1. She got a H1. And as I said, some of you down here probably know who I'm talking about. But it was a fantastic achievement. Now, that's not going to happen for everyone. It depends on a number of circumstances, including the exam coming up in a way that really suited her. Okay. However, do I think that a student can go from getting the average H5, H4 to H3, H2 in the real exam? The answer is yes. Maths comes together at the end, as long as you're practicing, as long as you're working hard, and as long as, I suppose, you have a bit of guidance on what to do and what not to do. Okay, these next questions I know are important to people. What are your tips for the most prevalent questions on the paper? Okay, I think they kind of mean the most common ones. How should we approach the papers with the new adjustments, timing wise? And is it worth doing extra questions in section A for safekeeping, hoping that we get marked on the best ones, which you do? Or should we stick to the instructed amount of questions? What are the most important topics and chapters to focus on to carry the most marks in the paper? So I'm going to answer that. That's exactly what I'm going to be going through. Now, that last part about what's the most important, what carries the most marks. So there's obviously a lot in that question. Now, here's what I'm going to say. In general, I'll talk through that first part in a moment when we're looking at the actual amount of questions you have to do. What do you think is the most likely I'll be talking about that. In your opinion, with the changes in the exam, is it advisable to leave out topics? I'll be talking about that. Our teacher has told us it's too risky. I will just say, so I have a group of students going for, we'll say, the top grades in this year's, in my own class in school. And what I'd say is I'm going to teach them the whole course. However, that is not the same thing as I think that each one of them should learn the whole course. I'd be expecting them to make decisions for themselves about which parts to focus on. What topics should you focus on if you're aiming for a H4? Well, I think that H4 student is a good student to think about for this next part. So this is when you turn over the exam this year. Okay, so when you're inside in the exam and you look at the instructions, you will see that there's the two sections, section A and section B. Section A is 120 marks. That's how much it's worth to you. And section B is 100 marks. So section A is what they call like the short questions, and section B is the long questions. Let me ask you this question though. Let me take a sip of water here. Let you do a bit of calculation here. How many marks are there in total on the paper? What do you reckon? How many marks in total on the paper? So you can get a maximum of 220, right? You can get a maximum of 220 here. So someone's telling me 220. But I know you can get a maximum, but I mean, how many marks are there on the paper in total? If there are 6 short questions and 4 long questions. You're busy doing some calculation. So there are 6 questions, right? 6, and they're 30 marks each. And there are 4 long questions and they're 50 marks each. Okay. Okay, one person has it. Well, actually, I'm given 3 answers. There's 3 answers here in front of me. One person says 280, one person says 380, one person says 480. What do you reckon? Well, here's what it is. There are 6 short questions at 30 marks each. So that's 180. There are 4 long questions at 50 marks each. So that's 200. So the total is 380 marks. 380 marks. You have to answer 220, or your best 220. Do you know what I mean? So you can get 120 marks in the short questions and 100 marks in the long questions. Just to note, that's only 58% of the paper. So you can leave out, 60, or not 62, that's not very good maths, is a 42% of the paper in terms of the marks that you have to answer. To explain it a different way, you must answer any 4 of the short questions, so 4 from the 6, and any 2 of the long questions, 2 from the 4. Now, I'm sure some of you in the actual pre-exam, the mock exam, were thinking you were very glad that you had that choice. And I bet some of you possibly didn't have it if you had done the exam before the choices became available, before the new accommodations were made clear. What I'll say to you, the questions were asked, should you do the minimum or should you do more? What I would say that every person should do is at least this. Do 5 short questions and 2 long questions. Now, you could argue you could do more than that as well, but that's what I think is the minimum. I wouldn't just do 4 short questions because you will have the time. Thanks to you guys who are all answering that question. You can see those extra instructions there, but those aren't as important for today. So now, the next question is, well, which topics should you be focusing on now, and which topics should you do in the exam? Yeah, and a comment came in here that some people were told to do it according to the original accommodations. So 5 short questions and 3 long questions, but now you will be marked according to the new ones, and that's absolutely fine. And remember, in the exam, it is the best 4 short questions, the best 2 long questions. So if you do extra, you get marked from your best ones. Okay, let's keep going here. Now, I'm going to show you this. What are we looking at here? This is paper 1. So paper 1, and by the way, of course, it was 220 out of 380 marks in both papers. I'm going to talk through a few different things here, but paper 1 comprises of 3 topics: algebra, functions, and number. Okay, functions and calculus and number. Now, because we've 40 minutes here, I'm going to go through some parts quickly. In summary, you should prepare to do the algebra questions and be ready for them and practice them. Okay, so don't think to yourself, I'm not going to do algebra, I don't like algebra. There's no real way around it. You know, you're just going to have to do algebra because algebra comes up in all of the other topics anyway. The good news for you is when you're revising functions, when you're revising number, when you're revising trigonometry, when you're revising geometry, even when you're revising probability and statistics, you'll be revising algebra. So it comes together as you're practicing the other ones. Sometimes people get back to algebra in 6th year and they say, God, this is much easier than I remember when I did it in 5th year. So let's just say that you must do algebra. Okay, you must prepare to do algebra anyway. I am going to say the same for functions and calculus, differentiation, integration. So functions, differentiation, integration. Last year, when we were preparing for the exam, you know, it was actually at the start of the 21-day maths course, which is a prep course for the Leaving Cert in the last 3 weeks on the run up to it. And the student said to me on the first night, she said, can I get away with leaving out differentiation? And the answer I said to her is the same I'll say to you: no. You must prepare to do differentiation because it comes up all over the place. It'll come up in paper 1, it can come up in paper 2. And if you're going to do differentiation, well, then you got to do integration, because integration can come up in the differentiation questions, and it does. And if you're doing integration and differentiation, then you have to do functions, because integration and differentiation are kind of just an extension of functions. So again, functions is built into those questions. But the good news, as I said, is when you're revising functions, learning functions, you're going to be getting better at algebra. So that's not as bad as it sounds. The part that I hope to bring some clarity to on tonight for you guys is number. So what is this strand called number? And I just point out one thing here. The 3 circles here are the same size, okay? And that's indicating that they're the same amount of marks, roughly speaking, are going for the 3 strands in paper 1. Now that's going to become a more important idea now in a minute, okay? So if anyone has any questions, if anyone has any kind of questions, just short ones, feel free to fire them into the chat. If they're longer questions, fire them into the Q&A and I will come back to them. So this is the number strand, okay? So there we go. The question is, what does number include? And here's my answer. So I preempted that one by having this ready. So number is a strand of maths that includes a lot of different things. Okay. Now the size of these circles or ovals is roughly speaking, broadly speaking, indicating how many marks have gone for these topics over the number of years. Okay. Not an exact science, but broadly speaking. In number, patterns, sequences, and series has been the most important of these topics, often coming up as a short and a long question. Okay, some years coming up as more than just 2 questions on paper 1 and sneaking into paper 2 as well. Again, I would advise everybody to do pattern, sequences, and series. Okay, so and there's a question came through. What is the most important part here? Okay, now I'm coming to that. Indices and logs. Again, very important part, and it's come up worth a lot. And I'm going to show you where that comes up in a minute. So I'm going to be saying everybody should do that. I'm going to go down here to area and volume. Area and volume comes up in different places. Again, I'm going to say that everyone should prepare for area and volume. Some are like, oh God, he's saying everyone should prepare for everything. But no, here's where we are now. The other four parts here: number system, induction, complex numbers, and financial maths. Here is where you have your choice in paper one of what to study. And the reason is because these topics aren't as interlinked to everything else. Okay. So number systems, if you know some of the older exam papers, you can picture the kind of Venn diagrams with natural numbers, integers, real numbers, complex numbers, and questions based on that. So that's kind of number systems. But also sometimes you could think about it. Last year there was stuff which is kind of arithmetic, distance, time, speed, that kind of stuff that could go in there as well, right? Now, that's kind of sometimes people wouldn't spend too much time revising for some of those ones. Hope they don't come up. But last year you did have to know a good bit about it. The three over here are where people have the choice. Some students and their teachers are not going to cover financial maths, and over the years that has worked out as a fairly good choice for teachers and students, because financial maths has not come up worth that many marks over the span of the last 6, 7, 8 years. Okay. So if students and teachers gambled on that in the past, it often turned out to be a good choice, right? However, it is, I'm going to say, strongly tipped this year. A lot of teachers feel that it is going to come up, the financial maths. And I must say, I do too. So in that in mind, it's kind of like, it's one that people have left out in the past and gotten away with, but it is likely to come up this year. Complex numbers will definitely come up this year. However, some teachers are leaving it out and some students are leaving it out. And I can understand that, because just like financial maths, it doesn't really lead into other topics. Complex numbers is kind of the end of it, so complex numbers is kind of the end of that topic. Okay. So what I mean by that is, like, that it's unlikely to come up in a longer question because of the fact that it doesn't have, we'll just call it, real world applications that can appear in your leaving cert. It's not going to lead into a max min question, that kind of thing. So some people are leaving that out. I will make a point about it in just 1 second, where I would maybe, again, some students might want to keep it on for this point. Induction is the one that for ye guys, if you're looking for a H6, if you're looking for a H5, if you're looking for a H4, I would be inclined to skip induction, right? And when I say skip it, this is what I mean. If your teacher is teaching induction inside in class, well, you're not going to take out your French book and start studying French and say, oh, I'm skipping induction. Of course not, because you're going to pick up stuff inside there anyway. Listening to the teacher talking about induction, you're going to pick up vocabulary about maths. You're going to be practicing other skills. But I'm just going to do something here now. But if I was going for, H6, H5, H4, I would not focus much time on it for two reasons. One, it's abstract, right? So if I take this as my induction little oval, right, it's very much over here in the algebra area. It's very abstract, and students often don't like it. Okay. And the other thing is, it hasn't been worth that many marks over the years, but it came up last year. So I think it's unlikely to come up this year. And if it comes up, this is the question I always ask students if they say to me, if a student says to me, I'm going to cover everything, but I ask them this question, I say, well, if induction comes up, are you going to do it? And oftentimes they'll say no, but they'll still say they might cover it. And the reason they're going to cover it is because they say, just in case. But if you're definitely not going to do it inside the exam, I don't think you should be studying it. I think you should be studying your sequence series because it links to algebra and functions. I think you should be studying your indices and logs because it links to algebra and functions. I think you should be studying your area and volume because it links to, it links to algebra, links to often max min questions, but you're going to see in a minute, it links to trigonometry as well. Then you have your choices over here. Again, complex numbers. It's linked to algebra. It is also linked to trigonometry. So like later on at 8 o'clock, I'll be doing the H1, H2 version of this. And I'll be saying to the students there to study complex numbers, because if you're going for H1, the trigonometry involved in complex numbers, it kind of helps, the two things help each other. Number systems is a bit of a mishmash of stuff, it's one I wouldn't worry too much about. And financial maths is this interesting one. It is tipped to come up this year. It could come up as a long question, but you would survive without it. Can induction come up as a part of another question? Well, it can. That's definitely can. I better keep moving here now, and that is one thing. Again, when you're inside in your class with your teacher, you're not going to kind of not listen to what they're saying about induction, because, of course, it could come up, and there are some easy induction questions. Here's your paper 2, geometry and trigonometry. That's one strand. Statistics and probability is the other. I hope you can see there that the geometry and trigonometry is a bit of a bigger circle than the statistics and probability. And the reason is it has come up worth more marks. Now, again, should you study everything in there? Well, I will just say, if we look at the whole course now, if you look at the whole thing, I will make this point just very quickly, that the geometry and trigonometry is very much linked to the algebra and the functions. Okay. Periodic functions, those guys, the wave functions, they can come up in paper 1 or in paper 2. Why? Because they say functions, so they can come up in paper 1, but they say trigonometry, so they can come up in paper 2. Statistics and probability is very much a standalone strand. However, I will say, those of you who are good at statistics and probability have a massive advantage when it comes to paper 2. Okay, so, all right, yes, okay. There's a question came in here. It's talking about one particular topic that was really prevalent in paper 2, and it was because they hadn't studied it. It was a real disadvantage, and it is. Okay, it is, if that's the case. I will just talk about trigonometry and geometry strand. You will see here that trigonometry is the big one. Okay. It's come up worth a load of marks every year. It will come up worth a load of marks this year. You cannot avoid trigonometry. Don't try and avoid trigonometry. You must do it. Okay. In the weekly lessons coming up, I think trigonometry is what we're starting with just after midterm, between midterm and Easter, because it's such a big one. Calculus is the other one we're focusing on. The circle is in there as well, I know. But if we look at this other part, so we have trigonometry, we have the line and circle. Now, these two, the line and circle, are ones that typically students do, because you often do them in 5th year. You learn them, you revise them, you've done them for the pre, etc., etc. Now, I asked you earlier in the survey what things people weren't doing, and an awful lot of people said they weren't. Not an awful lot, but a lot of people said they weren't going to do constructions. Could anyone tell me why you're not going to do constructions? It surprised me a bit. The theorems are a bit like induction. I'll talk about that now in a moment. Transformations aren't, that little bubble is a bit bigger than it should be for transformations, but it was a big word, so I needed a bigger bubble. And transformations are things like enlargements and different bits and pieces like that. They haven't come up worth that much marks. Cuts are your diagrams where you got to figure out the angles and stuff like that using geometry. Oh yes, so here's an answer for why you're not going to do constructions, because you get mixed up with them and you get them wrong. For constructions, it seems to be worth a little bit of marks, and I would rather practice problem solving over constructions, personal preference. Okay, I agree with all that, right? That's fair enough. However, I'm going to say this. If we look here at the theorems, right? These were the theorems that came up. Theorem 11 came up in 2010, 11, 12, and 15. Now, some of those were sample papers, so the 10, 11, 12, right? So, and then 2015. Theorem 12 came up in 2018. Theorem 13 came up in 2014 and 2021. Last year, that was one of my main tips, my main predictions for the Leaving Cert was that Theorem 13 would come up, and it did. A lot of people were tipping Theorem 11 last year to come up, but I did think it would be Theorem 13 if one came up. And here's what I'm going to say to you this year. If you see it here, if we look at 2015, there was no theorem then in 2016 and 17, came up in 2018. There was no theorem in 2019 and 20. Okay, there was in 21. Of course, there could be again this year. However, if I was going for a H6 and if I didn't like geometry, if I was going for a H5, if I was going for a H4, I wouldn't be that inclined to spend too much time practicing theorems. I would, by contrast, practice constructions. I know they're confusing at the start and they're easy mix up, but you will get the hang of them. They will. And here's a comment. I would definitely do constructions as they're free marks if you learn them once and learn them well. Well, there you go, Mark. I couldn't say it better than that. I have a kind of pre-record half-hour lesson on constructions that I give to students. And, you know, if you just follow the steps in that, practice enough times, bang, you have it. Constructions is very learnable. I know sometimes students kind of have a bit of an adversity to it at the start, but it's very learnable. The last part, so here's your geometry one. You'll notice here I left area and volume in here, right? Why? Because there's a link between the number strand and the geometry strand for that one. So between paper 1 and paper 2. So area volume is very important. This brings us to our last one, and I know we're kind of coming up to the time. I have left a bit of time, a bit of leeway for myself. Okay, so I won't leave without answering your questions. But our last strand is statistics and probability. In my opinion, it's a bit of a secret weapon for paper 2. If I asked you this, how many people have not done either or both of statistics or probability? If you type this in, right? If you type in the word, like if you haven't done statistics, type in statistics. If you haven't done probability, type in probability. If you haven't done both, type in both. And I'm going to just make a point about there. And it's this, that statistics and probability are often left to last because they don't interact that much with the other strands. So you can kind of leave them to last and learn them as a standalone. However, I always make this point. For some of you, for a lot of you, you know, so a lot of people haven't done stats, yeah, and a lot of people haven't done probability. For a lot of people, statistics would be your best topic. But for some people, statistics would be your worst topic. And the problem with leaving it till the end is you're not sure which one you're going to be. Is it going to be the best for you or the worst for you? But as I said, for more people than the other way, it is their better topic. They enjoy it. They can learn parts off, and they kind of understand that there's more words in there maybe than some of the other parts. So that's good. Equally with probability, probability is this great advantage that it's quick. So in paper 2, I give a little bit of different advice to paper 1. I say this: if you're doing probability, and if it comes up as a short question, do probability, but like say, then do 5 questions. So have 4 questions plus the probability. If you get it right, great. It'll be included as one of your top 4. If it kind of goes wrong, fair enough, no major loss, because it's very quick. Similarly with the long questions, if you did a probability long question, try to do 3 long questions then, okay? So that if somehow the probability one didn't go the way you thought, you still have 2 other ones. And you can get away with that because probability is quick. The last thing I'm going to point out here is basically you can break it down into 4 parts. There's what you call common sense probability, permutations, combinations, basic probability, you know, things like that, Bernoulli trials. And then there's stuff around Z-scores, conditional probability, stuff that's less common sense. If you're going to do probability, you kind of can get away with studying one of those, either P1 or P2, but basically you're going to do both. Similarly with statistics, you know, there's stuff around data and charts, you know, scatter graphs, line of best fit, correlation coefficient, mean, standard deviation. You want to know all those. But actually the biggest one is inferential statistics. And I'm going to leave you with this suggestion, that if you like statistics at all, you should focus a lot of attention on inferential statistics. And there's one particular reason. I'm going to say statistics in general, but inferential statistics in particular. And the reason is this. It is a very important part. It's been worth a lot of marks over the last number of years, but not last year. Statistics only came up as one question in paper 2 last year. It was a long question, but it wasn't a full long question. A good shot of that question was probability. Probability came up worth more marks than statistics last year. I expect that to be reversed this time around. Okay. And therefore, I would concentrate on the inferential statistics. Okay. I see there's 4 questions there in the Q&A. I'm going to go to those now. I just got to read out one comment there about permutations, combinations. Anna says they're not common sense to me at all. And I know a lot of people will agree with that. I do often say that, you know, this strand is the kind of one people really like or dislike, you know. So if you have any questions there, you can type them into the chat. Okay. I think some people are putting their hand up for that to say, yeah, that's me too. Okay. Oh, yeah. So here's the question. How long will the recording of this session be available for? It will be available forever. How about that? Because you've signed up for it. It's here. It's in your, like, you are now a member of this, you know, the tuition center. So when you log back in, you can always look back at this again. Okay. Do you need to know the trig proofs? Well, the answer to that, I suppose, we'd have to say, yes, there was a trig identity last year. You know, I'm going to say, because I would say you have to do trigonometry. You're not going to avoid trigonometry. I think you have to be able to do something in the trig proofs. You can't just leave them blank. Okay, what is inferential statistics? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I know I was probably just conscious of the time there. Inferential statistics is hypothesis testing, confidence intervals, test statistic, p-value, all those things. Now, feel free to fire in more questions there, by the way.